The summer of 2025 was expected to be calm for North American trade under the USMCA. After years of negotiation and compromise, businesses and workers on both sides of the border had finally settled into a sense of stability. The agreement was supposed to guarantee predictability, allowing industries to plan ahead and invest in growth. For many, it felt like a new era of cooperation and prosperity was just beginning. Instead, on July 10th, President Trump shocked the world by threatening a sweeping 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, set to take effect August 1st, unless Canada agreed to new terms. The announcement came suddenly, catching both governments and the public off guard. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, and social media erupted with speculation and concern. The threat was unprecedented in its scale and immediacy, sending ripples of anxiety through boardrooms and households alike. The move bypassed diplomacy, targeting Canada's entire economy and pressuring businesses to relocate to the US for exemptions and incentives. Companies that had spent years building cross-border supply chains suddenly faced the prospect of massive disruption. Some American factories even began advertising for Canadian workers, hoping to lure talent and production south of the border. The uncertainty left business leaders scrambling for answers, unsure whether to stay put or make drastic changes. This was more than a trade dispute. It was an attempt to force Canada back to the table, especially over its protected dairy sector. The US had long criticized Canada's supply management system, arguing it gave Canadian farmers an unfair advantage. Now, with the threat of tariffs looming, negotiators faced intense pressure to find a solution. Behind closed doors, talks grew tense as both sides weighed the risks of escalation. The announcement sent shockwaves through industries on both sides of the border, threatening $2 billion in daily trade. Automakers, steel producers, and farmers all braced for impact, knowing that even a short disruption could have lasting consequences. Stock markets reacted swiftly, with shares in key sectors tumbling as investors tried to gauge the fallout. The interconnectedness of the two economies meant that no one would be spared from the effects. With no formal policy details, uncertainty reigned, making planning impossible for businesses already facing global challenges. Many companies put investments on hold, while others began contingency planning for worst-case scenarios. The lack of clarity from both governments only deepened the sense of unease, as rumors and misinformation spread rapidly. The timing was pointed, coming just after Canada passed a law directly addressing the very issue at stake. The new legislation was seen as a bold move to assert Canadian sovereignty, but it also risked provoking further retaliation. Politicians on both sides of the border traded barbs in the media, each blaming the other for the escalating crisis. As the August 1st deadline loomed, North America braced for a high-stakes confrontation that could redefine the continent's economic future. Families, workers, and business owners watched the clock tick down, uncertain what the next day would bring. The world's attention turned to the US-Canada border, where the outcome of this standoff would shape not just trade, but the very relationship between two of the world's closest allies. Canada's response to mounting international pressure was not reactionary. It was preemptive, calculated, and deeply rooted in the country's agricultural identity. As global trade talks intensified, Canadian leaders recognized the need to act before being forced into a corner. The government moved swiftly, determined to protect the interests of its farmers and rural communities, who had long felt vulnerable to the shifting tides of international negotiations. On June 26, 2025, Bill C-202 became law, marking a historic moment in Canadian legislative history. The bill forbade any trade deal that would weaken Canada's supply management system for dairy, poultry, and eggs, a system that has been the backbone of rural prosperity for decades. This legislation was not just about economics, it was about preserving a way of life, ensuring that Canadian farms would not be sacrificed for short-term diplomatic gains. The law made it explicitly illegal for Canadian negotiators to offer the very concessions the US had been demanding for years. By doing so, Ottawa effectively tied its own hands, sending a clear and unmistakable signal to Washington and the world. Canada would not back down, no matter the pressure. Bill C-202 was crafted as a direct response to a history of unpopular trade concessions that had left many Canadians feeling betrayed. Memories of past deals that chipped away at supply management were still fresh, fueling public outcry and political resolve. For Canadian farmers, the bill was more than just legislation. It was a promise that their livelihoods, their families, and their communities would not be bargained away again. It was a rare moment of unity between rural and urban Canadians, all rallying behind the principle of food sovereignty. This was a calculated move, one that set Canada on a collision course with the United States by making any compromise on supply management impossible. The government knew the risks, but believed the stakes were too high to allow for flexibility. The legislation served as both a shield against mounting domestic pressure and a powerful statement of intent to the international community. To Canada's trading partners, the message was unmistakable. Food sovereignty was non-negotiable, and the country would defend its agricultural sector at all costs, even if it meant risking broader trade relationships. By passing the bill, Canada dared the U.S. to escalate the dispute, fully aware that Washington now had little room to maneuver. The move was bold, and it left the world watching to see who would blink first. The stage was set for a high-stakes standoff, with no easy diplomatic solution in sight, and both sides digging in for a prolonged battle. Canada had drawn its line in the sand, firm, unwavering, and clear. Now the world waited to see how America would respond to this unprecedented act of defiance. At the heart of the ongoing trade dispute between the United States and Canada lies a deeply entrenched system: Canada's supply management for dairy. This system, which has been in place for decades, is designed to tightly control the production and pricing of milk, cheese, and other dairy products within Canada. By setting quotas for domestic producers and limiting imports, Canada aims to protect its farmers from volatile global markets and ensure stable incomes for its rural communities. However, the U.S. views this approach as protectionist and fundamentally unfair, arguing that it creates an uneven playing field for American dairy exporters who want to access the Canadian market. President Trump's administration took a particularly hard stance, with Trump himself sending a letter that accused Canada of imposing tariffs as high as 400% on U.S. dairy products. This move painted Canada as an unreasonable trading partner, unwilling to play by the rules of fair trade. In reality, these sky-high tariffs only kick in when imports exceed Canada's strict quota limits. For most U.S. dairy products that stay within these quotas, the tariffs are much lower, and trade continues at a more manageable rate. Still, for American dairy groups, the quotas themselves are the real issue. They argue that these limits effectively lock U.S. producers out of what could be a highly lucrative Canadian market, stifling growth and opportunity for American farmers. U.S. farmers, especially those living and working in border states, have long pushed for greater access to Canadian consumers. They believe that true free trade should mean open competition, without artificial barriers or government-imposed limits. The U.S. government has threatened to impose a 35% tariff on Canadian dairy as a way to pressure Ottawa into opening its market. For Washington, this is seen as the ultimate leverage, a way to force Canada to reconsider its long-standing policies. Ultimately, for Washington, this dispute is about more than just milk and cheese. It's about upholding its vision of free trade, ensuring American businesses have fair access abroad, and setting a precedent for future trade negotiations around the world. For Canada, supply management is about food security, rural stability, and control over food standards, not just prices. The system was created to end boom-bust cycles and ensure stable incomes for family farms, which are vital to rural communities. Dismantling it could devastate small farms, leading to consolidation and the decline of rural Canada. Supply management also lets Canada enforce its own health standards, like banning certain growth hormones used in U.S. dairy. Canadians see this as food sovereignty, choosing quality and stability over slightly cheaper imports. The debate is a clash of philosophies, U.S. efficiency and scale versus Canadian stability and control. For Canada, defending supply management is about national identity as much as economics. Canada isn't the only target. Washington's tariff threats have gone global. The U.S. has issued similar ultimatums to the EU, Mexico, Brazil, and Asian partners, creating worldwide instability. The EU faces a 30% tariff and is preparing massive retaliation. Mexico and others are scrambling to negotiate exemptions. The U.S. is betting that access to its market will force concessions, but the strategy is risky. Some countries, like China, are adapting by strengthening ties elsewhere, bypassing the U.S. The global tariff offensive could backfire, accelerating new trading blocs and reducing America's influence. The world is watching to see if the U.S. can bend others to its will, or if it will isolate itself. The stakes are nothing less than the future shape of global trade. The looming trade war threatens real people, farmers, workers, and families on both sides of the border. U.S. farmers fear devastating retaliation, with many already struggling to survive. Manufacturing reliant on cross-border supply chains faces immediate disruption and rising costs. In Canada, a 35% tariff would hit nearly every export industry, leading to job losses and economic uncertainty. Consumers in both countries would pay higher prices as tariffs are passed down the line. Retaliation would make American goods more expensive in Canada, squeezing family budgets. The result: inflation, lost jobs, and a slowdown that hurts the very people tariffs claim to protect. Trade wars aren't just headlines, they're kitchen table crises. The human cost is impossible to ignore. The response has been swift and divided. In Canada, there's rare unity. Government and most industries back the hardline, especially after Bill C-202. Dairy farmers hail the law as a victory. Other sectors warn of economic pain but support standing firm. In the U.S., business and farm groups are alarmed, warning of job losses and higher costs. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and agricultural groups urge de-escalation, fearing retaliation. Legal experts note that stopping the tariffs will be difficult, as recent court decisions back presidential authority. With few options, industries brace for impact, hoping for a last-minute breakthrough. The contrast is stark. Canadian unity versus American division, each side feeling the stakes. The summer of 2025 is a turning point for North American trade. Canada's legislative stand and the U.S.'s tariff threat have pushed their relationship to the brink. If tariffs take effect, both economies face costly disruption and a possible shift toward new trading partners. The U.S. risks inflation and a damaged reputation. Canada may accelerate trade diversification. A diplomatic breakthrough is possible but unlikely given Canada's legal constraints. Even if resolved, trust will be hard to rebuild. The partnership's fragility is now exposed. The era of stable, predictable North American trade may be over. The future promises more disputes, more nationalism, and a relationship that can no longer be taken for granted.